Hello everyone, in this video we explain how to formulate and solve classification problems by using Python and Scikit-learn machine learning library. First we explain what are classification problems. For that purpose we'll consider the example that you can see over here. This example represents photographs of different subspecies of iris species. The classification problem is to distinguish and to classify different subspecies only on the basis of geometrical features of the petals. In our case, we will consider two geometrical features of the petal. We will consider the petal width, denoted by x1, and the petal length, denoted by x2. And let us assume that, for example, we only have two classes. This is the class A and this is the class B. So if someone gives me an example of the flower that you can see over here, I want to answer the following question. Does this example belong to the class A, that is to the subspecies A, or to the class B, that is to the subspecies B? And I want to answer this question by measuring the width and the length of the petal. So, by only measuring the width and the length of the petal, I want to answer the question. Does this example belong to the class A, that is to subspecies A, or to the class B, that is to the subspecies B? So let us see how to mathematically formulate and solve this problem. Let us first assume that we are given many examples of the class A. And having these examples, we can perform the following experiment. Namely, we can measure the petal width, denoted by x1, and the petal length, denoted by x2, of every example. Having these two measurements, we can place a point in the coordinate system x1 and x2. And let this point be A1, corresponding to example 1. Now, for the second example, we can repeat this procedure. We can measure x1 and x2, and we can obtain point 2. And having n examples, we can obtain an points. All these points A1, A2 until AN correspond to the class A. Similarly, let us assume that we are given many examples of the class B. And we can repeat the same experiment. We can measure petal width, denoted by x1, and the petal length, denoted by x2, for every example of the class B. And similarly, we can obtain the points B1 corresponding to the measurement of the first example, B2 corresponding to the measurement of the second example, and BM corresponding to the measurement of the mth example of the class B. A machine learning algorithm will try to learn to distinguish between these two classes. Arguably, one of the most simplest methods to distinguish between these two classes is to learn to basically draw a line that will somehow separate these 2 points. In this case, we can see that this line is basically closer to the points A, the points of the class A. So this line is not going to look like this. It's going to most likely look like this. Okay, so the machine learning classification algorithm will try to find the slope and the intercept of this line such that these 2 points or these 2 sets of points are somehow optimally separated. I'm not going to go into mathematical details explaining how the classification algorithms work. There are many classification algorithms. There's support vector machine, perceptron, there is a logistic regression. I will skip that part. That is, I will not explain these algorithms, and I will just explain the main ideas. Okay, to repeat, the machine learning algorithm will somehow learn to separate these 2 classes, and the most simplest way is just to find the line that separates these 2 classes. Now, once we have learned how to draw this line, we are faced with the following problem. Good. We have examples of A, we have examples of B, and we are somehow able to fit a line such that we are separating these 2 classes. Now, let's say that we are given a new example. And this example is not being used to learn to draw that line. That is, this is a completely new example, and we want to answer the following question. Does this example belong to the class A or to the class B? So what's the procedure? We take a measurement device, we measure x1, then we measure x2, and we take these 2 measurements and we map these 2 measurements into a point, into the plane x1 and x2. And let's say in this case, we obtain the point over here. Okay, you see that I draw here the letter A. Well, I draw this letter A because this point is below our classification line, and according to our algorithm, this basically point should belong to the class A. Similarly, if we take these 2 measurements and if we find out that they're located over here above the line, then okay, we can say with certain probability that our example belongs to the class B. And that's the main idea behind the classification method. Now, the examples of the class A and of the class B that are used to fit this line are the training examples. They're called the training examples because they're used to train our machine learning algorithm. That is, they're used to learn the slope and the intercept of this line that separates 2 classes. The example over here, that is the new example, is used for basically testing the performance of our learning method. This test example is not being used during the training process, and that's why it's called the test example. In practice, we will use many examples or many data points to learn the features or to learn how to basically separate 2 sets of points. And in practice, having this learned model, once we are presented with a new example, we'll just take measurements and properly classify this example on the basis of picture that looks like this, or on the basis of some numerical method that works in a similar fashion. Okay, now we slowly transition to Python and to the explanation of how to code the classification algorithm. And to make your life easier, I've created basically a web page or a post that nicely summarizes everything that I will explain in this video. A link to this post is given in description below. While explaining how to code the classification algorithm, I will consider a slightly more complex case. That is, I'll consider the case of not only 2 classes, I will consider the case of 3 classes. I will teach you how to generate this graph that you can see over here. This graph basically represents decision regions, or the regions corresponding to 3 different classes that are learned from the set of data. So these are basically petal widths, petal heights of certain subspecies corresponding basically class 0. The green ones are basically, or the green circles are basically examples corresponding to class 1, and these triangles, the orange triangles, are basically samples of the points corresponding to class 2. And these are my training samples. This is how the regions are being basically classified, or how the regions are being separated, and this is the performance on the test data. You will learn how to generate these graphs at the end. These graphs are very informative. First, I explain the main steps that you need to perform while training a model. The first step is always to explore and clean the model data. You are going to basically load a database that's going to be large, and you will first have to do basic exploration of your database. And then you will have to clean the data. First, you're going to see, for example, in your data sets, are there some missing values? Maybe there are some missing values. Well, then you're going to basically fill in these missing values either by interpolating your data set, or using the median or a mean of all the values, or using some other more complex method. Then you'll basically eliminate duplicates from your model database, or actually from your database samples. Then you will explore it by looking, for example, into some basic statistics, standard deviation. You will look into maybe histograms, maybe some correlations, maybe some features, or some samples are basically correlated. You can eliminate samples that are correlated because they don't give you so much information, or you can perform some model order reduction. I'm not going to explain all these steps, since the problem I'm considering in the example I'm considering is introductory. However, in practice you might experience the need to perform these steps. Then the second step is to prepare the data set. This means basically to scale the data, because often the magnitudes of different features or different samples are different. So for example, petal width or petal height in this case are going to be in the same magnitude. They're going to be from 1 centimeter to 5 centimeters. However, in different classification problems, you might have the problem that one basically variable, the samples corresponding to one variable, let's say samples corresponding to x1 are in the range from 1 to 10. However, then you have x2 variables, and these variables are in the order of several millions or something similar. So you have to make sure that all the variables are approximately in the same range, that they are from 0 to 1, or that they are normalized. That's called basically scaling the data. And also there are other steps in preparing the data that I will not discuss here. I will not discuss them over here. Then the third step is to split the data into train and test samples. Your database has to be split. One part should be dedicated to training. That is, I'm going to use these samples to learn my model. In the case of the iris classification problem, I will use certain samples to learn how to fit my line. And then the second part of your database will be used as a testing. This part of database is not used for training. That is not used for fitting the line. This part of the data set is used for validating performance of your algorithm or of your fitted model by using the data that's never being used or never seen during the training step. Okay, and then finally, this step is very important. You need to visualize the results in order to visually verify the performance. In my case, here's my visualization step. Basically, I can visualize over here the performance on my method, on the test data. I can see that I only have, let's say, two misclassifications because these two samples should correspond to this region. However, they correspond to the blue region, so the class 1 here is wrongly classified as class 0, and I only have two samples, and I see that most samples belong to their proper class. Just to mention, this is the test data that's never being used for actually learning the model. Okay, so let us explain the code for learning the model and for loading the data. First, I will reset my workspace by erasing all the variables. You can notice here that I'm using the Spider Python development environment. I really like Spider since it somehow reminds me of MATLAB, and in Spider you can do something like this. You can select the piece of code, you can do the right click, and you can do the right cell, and this piece of code will be executed. Okay, so the first step is to import the necessary libraries. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I will be using Scikit-learn to explain how to train a classifier. Scikit-learn is a very interesting and very nice library that contains many classification, deep learning, Bayesian machine learning method. I strongly suggest you that you learn this library, and this video can be a nice introduction to this library. So first I'm going to import basically from the Scikit-learn. It's called Sklearn. I'm going to import data sets. So this dataset module contains basically database of different data sets, and you will see later that I will import the iris dataset. Besides the iris dataset, you may have many other datasets such as, for example, images used for classification of handwritten digits. You have some housing data, you have some weather data, you have time series. Just name it, you have that database in this dataset. So first we import the datasets, then we import the NumPy library for performing basic operations on matrices and vectors. Then from the Scikit-learn, I import this function test train split or train test split. This function basically divides the database into two parts. One part corresponds to training data set that's used for learning the model, and another data set called the test data set is used for model validation, as we have explained previously. So I will import this function. Then I will import the standard scaler. The standard scaler is basically used to scale your data. As I mentioned previously, often the magnitudes of your data points are different, so you want to somehow scale them such that they belong to the same interval. You have, besides the standard scaler, you have many other options to do that, but the standard scaler somehow standardizes the data. I will not explain more about standard scaler. You can find all that information online. Then I will import the perceptron classifier. Perceptron is one of the most, I would say, simplest algorithms for performing classification. This algorithm was probably developed 1960s, 1970s, when machine learning was in its infancy. It's a relatively simple method for classification. Then I will import one function I wrote for visualizing the data. So this function is used to make these graphs, and the source file of this function is given over here. I will post this function on GitHub as well as this code, so you can freely use it in your project if you need it. Okay, now that I have all the functions and necessary modules in my memory, I can load my data set. So from the data sets that's being imported over here, I will choose the function called load iris, and this function will load my iris data set. So let's type iris data set, or you can just type print iris data set. So here's your iris data set. This data set, or better to say dictionary, contains keys and values. This key data contains these values. The rows are basically the samples. These are our examples of our different flowers, and the columns correspond to different geometrical features. Notice here that we basically have not only two geometrical features, not only petal width and petal length, we also have two others that correspond to, I think, sepal width and sepal length. And we can basically check this by scrolling down and looking into some information that's given over here. And over here you can see basically what are the feature names. They're sepal length, sepal width, petal length, and petal width. So basically the first two rows are sepal length and sepal width, sepal length and sepal width, and petal length and petal width. Okay, and then we have now how many samples, we'll check them later. And we have targets. We have different targets. We basically have three targets. Targets are classes. So we have three classes. We have class 0, class 1, and class 2. And here are target names or classes names. They are Setosa, versicolor, and virginica. These are three different, basically, subspecies of our main iris species. I obtained this information by reading basically the structure of my dataset. However, you can directly extract feature names by just typing iris dataset feature names, and you will obtain basically these are the feature names corresponding to rows of my data. So this will be, for example, x1 or x1, x2 in my figure. Now I can also see the target names. These are the target names. This means that I have three classes, Setosa, versicolor, and virginica. And I can also extract my data as a NumPy array. So here's my data. And I can also extract my classes. So what happens here, this is one flower. These are the measurements for one flower. And I know that these measurements correspond to class 0. Similarly, this last sample over here, these are the measurements of the last flower, and I know that this flower belongs to the class 2. Now, since basically I will be using only two features for the classification, that is I'm going to use column number 3 and column number 4, that is I will use petal width and petal length, right? I will extract from our data sets my X features. And now the X feature will be a matrix with two rows. Similarly, I will extract the target classes, that is, I will extract all the classes I need. So here are my target classes. Okay, so here are my target classes. Now, the next step is to divide my database that's represented by X features and X and Y target classes into the train and test data samples. So I'll be calling the function train test split. I will provide the original X features and original targets or classes. Then I will determine test size. Test size will be 20% of the total database. I'll choose a random state such that I can reproduce my results, meaning that when I run this function, my data will be shuffled and will be randomly shuffled. However, if I run it again, it will be shuffled in the same way. This random state ensures that. And here I specify the type of sampling. I'm choosing stratification as a type of sampling. Stratification is very important since I want to make sure that basically proportion of different classes in my sample data set correspond to the proportion of my classes in the population. Here is the population, and here we can see basically that's probably distributed 33% of samples belong to the class 0, 33% correspond to the class 1, and 33% correspond to the class 2. So my sample, my X train and Y train, as well as X test and Y test samples should have the same proportion of classes. So I can do that. I can basically extract my train and test data set, and then I can type something like this. I can xtrain.shape. Okay, so I have 120 training samples, and I have here 30 test samples. Okay, and here I can verify that I'm basically having that my certification method works okay by basically calling numpy bin count. And the numpy bin count will basically give me how many samples belong to certain class. I have 50, 50, 50. Let's see, in the train data set, I have 40, 40, 40. And in my test data set, I have basically 10, 10, 10. So in my original database, my classes are distributed according to basically this law: 1/3, 1/3, class 0, 1/3, class 1, 1/3, class 2, 1/3. Similarly, in my test and train samples, I have the same distribution, so the stratification works perfectly. Now, the next step is to call the standard scaler. So the standard scaler is called over here. This is basically the calling of the constructor. I construct my standard scaler, and then I fit my features. So here I will basically fit my features, but before we even look into the features, it's good, let's say, to write something like this. I'm going to have a new variable just to save my original features that are not being fitted, that are not being transformed, right? And then I'm going to call the standard scaler. Okay, now once I train my standard scaler, I can call basically the transform method that transforms the samples, right? I take the original X features trained that are extracted by basically my train test split, and I transform them, I scale them, and I obtain a new data set. Here is my data set, a new data set. Okay, so here are my examples that are transformed. Let's see the original examples. Okay, so let's see what happens. So I have from 1.5 to 0.4, and once I scale them, I have from -1 to a3 to -105. So I have basically standardized in a standard method. I've standardized my data. The similar thing happens with the test data set. You transform the test data set and you standardize the data. Now, here I will initialize my perceptron classifier. So eta, this variable here, is a learning rate. Smaller learning rate corresponds to more stable learning. However, we need basically more samples to learn, not more samples, more iterations to learn. Higher values of eta correspond to unstable convergence. That is, sometimes convergence can be unstable, however the convergence is faster. And random state means that I can always get a reproducible results if we have some shuffling, some random shuffling inside. So I will call my perceptron classifier, and again After I do that, I will call the fit method of my classifier, where I will I will give as arguments my train and basically train x features and y train vector, and we will learn the model. So here is our model. Model is being learned. So I'll just execute this again to make sure that I executed everything. And once I'm done, I can basically call my predict function. Here I provide basically the test data, the X feature test, that is part of the X features that are used for test and that are never used for training the network. And I basically obtained my predicted classes, and we can basically compare these predicted classes with basically our original classes, and we see here what's happening. So these are the predicted classes, and these are the basically original classes, and we see, for example, we have a good match 2 2 0 0. Here we have a mismatch, then we have 3 good matches, then we have 2 2 2 good matches again, etc. Now we can check the performance by basically comparing the total number of misclassified results. We can do that by using this Boolean masking. We just compare where these vectors are not equal. We will, if you execute this, we'll obtain Boolean vector false, 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 true, 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 and then we just sum them up, and we obtain the number of misclassifications. So let's see how many misclassifications we have. Okay, we only have 2 misclassifications. These are very good results. And then we plot, basically we calculate the percentage of misclassifications. So let's see what's happening here. Okay, we have 6% of misclassified example. That's not bad, not bad. And let's now plot the decision regions by calling the function that I created over here. This function will basically plot you everything you need to know. Okay, so here are the results. The left panel basically represents the performance of my classifier and decision regions corresponding to different classes for the training data set. So these are my training data samples: class 0, circles, green circles class 1, and triangles, orange triangles class 2. And so these are my decision regions. So I can already see that in my training I have some misclassifications. This is because these 3 classes are not linearly separable, and the data set is designed like that. Unfortunately, we cannot do better. We can maybe try to use decision trees or some other classifier. However, with the linear classification regions or straight line classification regions, we cannot do much better. There are much more advanced classifications that can give us nonlinear functions, and you might have like a snake-looking function that's able to classify this more accurately. And so this is the performance of my classification algorithm on the test data. So these are the predictions. The test data is never used for classification, for learning how to basically train the classifier, and you can see the results. I only have 2 misclassifications. You can basically download this function from GitHub, and you can use it in your project. Okay, that will be all for today. I hope that you like this video. If you like the videos I make, please subscribe or support my channel. Thank you very much and have a nice day.